My name is Brad Peterson, and I'm a professor here at Stony Brook University. I welcome you tonight. I have the privilege of having many excellent graduate students in my lab, and today one of them will be sharing a portion of her dissertation work with you. Brittney Scannell was, I first met her as an undergraduate volunteering in my lab. She then went on to graduate from Stony Brook with magna cum laude with very high honors. And she then very nearly sank one of our university vessels and ran away to go work with the Peconic Estuary, Peconic Bayman. He was there for a bit, and then she went on to work as a shellfish restoration technician for Cornell Cooperative Extension over in Southold. After doing that for a year, she was convinced to come back to graduate school. She applied as a master's student. I convinced her to upgrade to a Ph.D. Things that she won't be able to tell you about tonight is her fun time that she spent over in Saudi Arabia in the Red Sea, taking care of critically endangered guitar fish, but you might want to talk to her about that. She's also working on her certificate from the Advanced Graduate Certificate in Computational and Data Science from the Institute of Advanced Computational Science. So she's kind of a math smarty. She's given a bunch of presentations in public settings. She mostly enjoys doing this with a beer in her hand, but we can't do that here tonight. And she's also a mentor for the Society of Women in Marine Science. So she's very active, very busy. And although we no longer let her drive the boats, we do let her spend a lot of time hopping over the side of them, which is what you will learn about tonight. So I'm very excited to welcome Brittney to the podium for tonight.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Brad. So there won't be lots of math in here tonight. What we'll be kind of talking about is what the name of the talk is: one fish, two fish, blackfish and bluefish. It's going to be a tour of New York State's artificial reefs. So we're going to go over tonight what the artificial reefs are, where they are, who and how different fish on Long Island use them, and how yourself can use them. So Brad gave me a little bit of an introduction. Where's my mouse? There it is. But before we dive on into the talk, I figured I'd give you a little overview of my experience on the reefs myself. So like Brad said, I started as an undergrad in the lab, working inside of the bay, and then I became a PhD student, where my research focuses on how different sharks and fish utilize habitat on the artificial reef. So over the past 4 years here at Stony Brook, I have logged over 200 dives across all of the artificial reefs on Long Island. And this project started back in 2019. We started with just one receiver, 2 different types of fish species. And over the past 4 years, it's grown into a project that encompasses all 12 of the artificial reefs, over 70 receivers, and 13 different species of our local fish. So on these artificial reefs, did anyone come here tonight, see the name of the talk, and they didn't even have any idea that we have artificial reefs here on Long Island? Yeah. So I want you guys to kind of close your eyes before we start. I want to imagine that you're sitting underwater and you're sitting at an artificial reef. You see all the life swimming by, and what do you picture? So maybe you picture something like this. It's clear, it's tropical, there's soft coral, there's hard coral, there's fish swimming by. Or maybe you see something like this, a scene where researchers are working with coral. They're trying to regrow lost coral due to ocean warming. Well, that's not exactly what it's like here on Long Island. On Long Island, we only have one species of coral. It's the northern star coral, and it's a non-reef building species. It's native to the Western Atlantic. And so what makes it different than your normal coral species that you think of is it lacks zooxanthellae. So instead of relying on that symbiotic relationship with that algae, it uses its tentacles to directly collect plankton from the water. So if those aren't what we have here, what makes an artificial reef? An artificial reef is any benthic structure, natural or man-made, that's deployed on the sea floor to influence some type of physical, biological, or socioeconomical processes as they concern to fisheries, oceans, and conservation and habitat. So artificial reefs, they come in all different shapes, sizes, depths, and materials. So here you can see, even though we're only in 4 feet of water, This is some type of structure, man-made structure that we've placed on the benthos on the bottom that's trying to influence the growth and potentially restore seagrass. And at the same time, it's creating lots of habitat for tiny tropical and juvenile fish. And so if you want to learn more about this, you can check out Flynn's master's. There's a presentation coming up soon this May. But they don't have to be just strictly functionals. So artificial reefs can also work as beautiful art pieces and sculptures at the same time that they're providing both restoration and diving opportunities. So tonight, before we get started, we're going to play a little game called Will It Reef? So now that you've got a little bit of a sense of what an artificial reef is, you've seen some examples, I'm going to show you different types of materials, and I want you guys to tell me if you think it will function as an artificial reef habitat. So for all those on Zoom, feel free to use the reaction buttons, give a thumbs up, thumbs down to see what you think. Start off nice and easy. Can we use trash? So if I dump plastic bottles, plastic bags into the ocean, will that give us the same benefits as other artificial reefs? No, you all got it right. Perfect. So plastics, they'll degrade to microplastics. They end up in the stomachs of fish and marine animals. So none of this is permanent structure on the ocean. So it'll end up floating around. It may end up attracting fish, but it's not going to create that type of ecosystem that we're looking for. How about tires? If I dump tires in the ocean, can it function as a habitat? So they did this in Florida in the 70s. They took hundreds and hundreds of tires. They strapped them together using steel clamps, and they attached them to the bottom to create the Osborne artificial reef. So you can see it attracted fish, things grew on it. However, it ended up being a massive environmental disaster that cost the state of Florida over $151 million to clean up. So those steel clips that they use, they degraded over time. With tropical storms, they came in and then the tires broke free from the structure, and they ended up doing lots of damage to actual natural reefs in the area, and mostly just ended up washing up on shore and breaking down and leaching toxic plastics into the ocean. So no tires. How about a nice 74-foot steel boat named the Reliable? What do we think? So the DEC took the Reliable all the way from upstate New York, put it on another tugboat, and ferried it down the Hudson River, where it came to rest at its final destination, the Shinnecock Artificial Reef. So here we have a video. This is 2 months after the deployment. So you can see that there's algae on the reef, but mostly you can still see the paint, you can see the blue, you can see the white, still all the numbers. And now we've jumped to 2 years later. So we have lots of fish swimming around. We can see blackfish, we can see black sea bass, and all of the things that have grown. So we still have algae, but now we have blue mussels encrusting over the areas. We have barnacles, we have hydroids, lots of life, lots of smaller fish. So I think that is a success. We'll say we can use steel vessels as artificial reefs. How about pieces of the Tapan Zee bridge? So we have different materials. That's from actually the largest expansion of the program in 2018. The decommissioned Tapan Zee Bridge was added at reef sites all across Long Island. They took different steel girders, different pipes, concrete, and here we can see it a couple of years later. So it's different than the Reliable. There's not as much vertical structure, but there's lots of space and complex habitat with natural bottom in between for mussels to grow, starfish, flounder to move around through and hide in different pieces. So score one for the Tapan Zee Bridge. So in 2021, we had the opportunity to actually go out with the New York State DEC and watch as they deployed the 50-foot vessel, the Jane. Before they sunk the vessel, we gave them GoPros. And then after it had been down, they deemed it safe. We dove to retrieve the GoPros and got footage of what it's like to actually be on a sinking artificial reef. And it's things like the Jane that make really good artificial reefs. So they're stable in a storm. This isn't going to be blown away. They're made of a long-lasting material that isn't going to break down, and it's non-toxic. Things like the Jane have high structural complexity. So the surfaces have texture that's going to allow space for mussels to grow on. And it also has high structural complexity. So it's got vertical relief for fish to swim around, and then lots of spaces for fish to hide on. And that's the basis of the New York State Artificial Reef Program. So this program was created in 1960s, but it dates all the way back to people deploying reefs in New York in the 1920s. And today we have a series of 12 reefs around the island. We have 2 in Great South Bay, 2 in the Long Island Sound, and then we have 8 that span from Queens all the way out to Suffolk County. And these reefs, they range from different sizes from 7 to 700 acres, depths that are from 14 to 130 feet, and range from 1 to 12 miles offshore. So now that we know that we have these reefs, and we have a lot of them, but what are they actually doing for our ecosystem? So if you were today to swim directly offshore from Long Island and look at the ground, you would see nothing but really a lot of sand and mud. So there's no hard structure. What these reefs do is that they provide structure in areas with naturally soft bottoms. So over time, these reefs start out as just metal, but they get covered in algae, in mussels, in barnacles, and that these organisms are really the first settlers. So from there, we have fish and crustaceans that come into the reef from surrounding areas. And then these artificial reefs become important foraging grounds, shelter, spawning areas later on. And it's important to note that they're not just attracted to these reefs. At the point where we have this entire ecosystem, they're also producing biomass. So they're not just drawing fish from different areas, new fish and new life is being formed here. So it's important, we have these reefs. If we want to protect the species that are using these reefs and design better reefs to support the fish that live here, how do we do that, right? Fish underwater, it's not like just putting a GPS collar on your dog. Satellite telemetry doesn't work underwater. It's deep, it's murky, you can't see the fish. They're constantly in motion and they migrate often over vast distances. That's why we use acoustic telemetry. So if we break down the word acoustic telemetry, we have acoustic, which is sound, and telemetry, which is just relaying information over space, which is exactly how it works. Using acoustic telemetry, we have 2 main components. We have tags, which are electronic transmitters that broadcast series of pings, so little sound pulses through the water. And then we have receivers, which are basically small data logging computers that are anchored within or on structure and that listen for tagged fish. So when a signal is identified, that unique code that that tag is sending out is saved along with the date and the time. So here we can see what an actual receiver looks like underwater. We have one right when we put it in, and then a couple of months later, they start to get biofoul, they get covered in algae. So this is a particularly nice one. Sometimes there'll be lots and lots of mussels that grow over them. But a way that you can think of acoustic telemetry is basically an easy pass system for fish, similar to what we use on our toll roads with our cars. So just as you drive to the toll booth, if you drive under the sensor, an acoustic fish is kind of heard in the same way by a receiver. And then each time, just as you drive by, you get an electronic stamp and you get a bill. A little date time is recorded for a fish. So if we're to kind of look at the scene that's actually happening underwater at a piece that we've put a receiver in, we can see that there's a large group of fish, and specific individuals in that group are tagged and are swimming around a receiver. So we only detect fish that are in the range of that receiver. And the range of that receiver depends on a couple of different things. So that's physical and biological characteristics of the water. So that's temperature, turbidity. If it's raining and there's a lot of sound, it can be harder to hear fish, or you could have snapping shrimp that are making noise and also decreasing the detection range. And what that looks like on our end is we get where the receiver location came from, the detection, all of the values and the information. And we also have 300 more lines of this information. So that's basically what we use the data that we collect from these receivers. So if we zoom out a tiny bit from just this single piece, and we look at what one reef looks like, we can actually see what the DEC does to create this reef. So they'll take different cleaned and recycled materials, and they'll sink them in patch reefs. So just as we were talking before, what this does is it takes complex structure and it puts it in places where there is soft bottom. So there would be nothing for these organisms to settle on, and we're providing things for them to settle on, to colonize, increasing food resources. And on top of providing habitat, these artificial reefs, they also provide diving opportunities and fishing opportunities for recreational fishers. And at the same time, it's this patch structure that also protects the fish from increased fishing pressure. So by dispersing it across pieces, we're also protecting the fish. So over the past 2 years, we've had our receivers out at the artificial reefs in a box pattern. So this lets us know about the presence and the absence of fish in the area. We know when a fish gets to the reef, how long the fish is at the reef, and what distance they're traveling. So if they're moving from north to south, if they're moving from east to west. But the power of acoustic telemetry really comes from how you design your array. So with different array designs, you can look at different questions. And if we set our transmitters, our receivers, to ping like tags, and we move them close enough so they can hear the tags, and then they can hear themselves pinging, what we can do is we can use math to triangulate the actual location of a fish in the reef. So we don't know that it's just somewhere nearby the reliable, we know its exact location. And then if we pair that with a sensor tag, we can get the depth in the water column. So we get an actual XYZ position of the fish. So that results in something like this. We can get an actual track of a fish looking at how it's using the water and the habitat. So if we look at the receivers that the Peterson lab has deployed, along with some collaborations from other labs, we see that we currently have 120 receivers put out across the island with 13 different species tagged. And this covers the North Shore, Peconic Bay, the estuaries, and the span of Nassau to Suffolk. So we have receivers, but we also need to put out tags. So over the past 2 years, we've been working incredibly hard along with some other labs to get tags in the water. We've been able to leverage some of the infrastructure from the work we've been doing with offshore wind to tag 13 different species. And there is far more to come. So over the next 3 years, we are obligated to put 800 more tags in fish, which is a lot of tags. So we have a good sense of the species that we're looking at, how they're moving across the South Shore of Long Island. So we have tags for striped bass, black sea bass, sand tigers, dusky sharks, smooth dogfish, flounder, skates, tautog, sandbars, weakfish, bluefish, and winter skate currently. And so for some of those species, like the shark species and the striped bass, we have already in the water depth sensors with them. And this coming summer, we'll be putting out depth sensors for tautog and black sea bass. So these tags, the size depends. We have a different range. We use different sizes for different fish. So a small black sea bass is going to be weighed, and we're going to use that smaller tag that is about 2.5 centimeters. And for any of our larger fish, about 1 meter in size, we're going to use that biggest tag, a V16. Each of our tags are implanted inside the body cavity of a fish surgically. And then that incision is closed using sutures, as you can see here on a striped bass. And so for different fish, we use different tagging methods, even though the actual surgery and procedure is the same. For smaller fish that we can bring on the boat, we will tag them inside a tagging tray on the boat. Or for larger fish, we'll tag them over the side of the boat. So going into a little bit more depth and looking at some of the species that we're looking at, we have black sea bass. So black sea bass are an important commercial and recreational reef-associated fish that we have here on the island. The way that we would catch and tag a black sea bass would go something like, we would go out on the boat to the Shinnecock Reef, we would put our lines in the water using hook and line, and then we would drift over some type of artificial reef structure. When we catch a fish, we want to make sure that we reel them in nice and slow so we can avoid barrow trauma to the fish. Once they're on the boat, we anesthetize them, we weigh them to decide what tag we're going to use, we measure them, and then we'll do the surgery. So once the surgery is finished, we'll let them recover in a tank of fresh salt water, and then we'll release them back down to the reef. And so black sea bass, you can find them all across the eastern seaboard. They range from Maine to Florida. And as the ocean temperatures have been warming, we've actually been able to see expansion of them northward. These guys, They begin their lives as female and they become males at around 2 to 5 years, which you can see. They'll develop large blue bumps on their heads. So these two fish are smaller females that over time will transition into males and then live up to 20 years. So here you can see a video of black sea bass swimming around, lots and lots of black sea bass. Everything you see in this video is a black sea bass. But if you pay attention, you might find some other interesting marine life. And so over the past year, we've been tagging and tracking a group of black sea bass that started at the artificial reef. So black sea bass, they have an inshore offshore migration as the year goes on. And this is the first year looking at, we were actually able to say that black sea bass return to the same exact artificial reef that they came from. So their site artificial reef is important to the fish. We were able to tell this. We could see that they were moving offshore because they actually briefly stopped at the 12-mile artificial reef, which is 11 miles south of the Shinnecock Reef. So the next species that is heavily associated with these artificial reefs are tautog. Tautog, you can find them from Nova Scotia down to Georgia, and they're thought to exhibit that same inshore-offshore migration. On the artificial reef, they'll use those big, strong jaws to eat crabs and mussels and barnacles. And tautog, they mature quite slowly, and they aren't sexually active to the age of 4, and they can live up to 35 years. So like we were saying, they're known to have that migration. When the temperature gets around 50 degrees, they'll leave to go offshore. But over the past year, from our tagging and tracking, we observed a population of tautog that actually stayed at the reef all season long. So these fish that we looked at didn't exhibit an offshore movement. They stayed throughout the winter. And then in May, when it's their spawning season, they actually moved off the reef. So we don't know where they go when these fish move off the reef, but that lines up with their spawning time. So these fish were most likely heading closer to the estuaries, to the mouth of the estuaries, inside the estuaries to spawn. And so then another little fun, interesting fact that we were able to see with the tautog was that 7 of the fish that we tagged were actually caught by fishermen on the reef. So because we have some overlap in our array, we're able to basically see the fish tagged and pulled right out of the middle, and they didn't come back. So someone got dinner, not me. But we're also interested in some bigger predators that use these reefs. So we're looking at questions like, are these sharks just swimming by the artificial reefs, or are they stopping, are they resting and using them as foraging grounds themselves? So this summer, we tagged around 80 sharks, specifically looking at sandbars, sand tigers, dusky sharks, and smooth dogfish. So similar to the fish, we use hook and line to pull sharks to the side of the boat. And from there, we'll take measurements of length and girth. And then what we'll do is we'll flip a shark upside down, where they'll go into a state of tonic immobility. So for the fish, we have to use an anesthetic. For sharks, all we have to do is turn them upside down, and that basically makes them into a state similar to being unconscious. So while the shark is upside down, the first thing that we'll do is we'll do the acoustic surgery. Same as that fish, it goes inside the body cavity. And then we'll also take a fecal swab to look at the diet of the sharks. Then we'll take a fin clip to look at the genetics. And then another great thing about working with the South Fork Shark Museum shark research, is that, first of all, they're amazing shark fishermen, but we also get the opportunity to work with the public and kind of show them what shark research is like in a day on the water. So we'll draw blood and we'll take muscle biopsies to look also at diet, but then to look at, more questions later on. And we'll bring that samples back to the lab. We'll work them up. And then, a good sign of a good workup is that everyone is smiling. Our undergraduates are smiling. Greg is happy. Our captain is happy. And the shark also has a nice big smile. So now that everyone's happy, we will release them. So this is some footage taken by Chris Papara of Fish Guy Photos of a day out on the water of us releasing some juvenile dusky sharks, which we caught quite a lot of this summer. So since we just tagged those sharks this summer, we have just a tiny bit of preliminary data to kind of orient you to what's going on. We have 2 panels. On the left, we have kind of what the water column looks like on average at the Moriches artificial reefs, which you can see on the picture of Long Island, that large gray dot. So we have sand, and then we have artificial reef structure. So the Santa Moriches Reef is mainly composed of vessels, and the average height of a vessel is 18 meters. So then we have the entire water column, and then especially in the summer, we have lots of forage fish. We have bunker swimming through the water. And if we look on the other panel, we're looking at the distribution of depth in the water column of dusky sharks and sand tiger sharks. So these two panels, they line up exactly. 0 meters, the surface lines up with the surface, and the bottom lines up with that bottom. So we can get a look at these two different species and just start to parse out how these two species are using the water column differently. So a species like the dusky shark, they're an opportunistic mid-water forager. They spend far more time up at the middle and top of the water column, chasing bunker at the surface. And then you have something like a sand tiger, which tends to stick much closer to the bottom, where they'll feed mainly at night on different fish, and they'll come up to the surface to actually gulp air occasionally. So, and if you look at that red line, the average depth of the sand tigers actually lines up perfectly with the average depth of the artificial reef. So just using this depth data, we can't pinpoint exactly where we are, but this is the beginning of kind of being able to say that sharks are using these artificial reefs. It'll take that exact location data to say where in the reef these structures are, but we can say that sand tigers are hanging out at the reef at about the depth of the structure. So sharks are really cool, fish are cool, but there's also a lot of different things down at the reef hanging out. So here we have footage taken from 12-mile artificial reef. Now we're going to focus a little bit more on the invertebrates and things that are encrusting the reef. So we have things like the Farb's sea star, which you can find at a lot of the artificial reefs. And then if you look closely at all of the structures, so you can see things like blue mussels, hydroids, anemones that kind of give the reef a little pop of color in that really green landscape. And so over the past 4 years, we have identified over 1,400 different individuals using the artificial reefs. So during the warmer months, we'll see different, more pelagically associated sharks like threshers and makos moving up and down the coast of Long Island, chasing prey. And we'll also see bigger white sharks, 13-foot white sharks, doing their migration, moving north towards Massachusetts, where there are big seal colonies that they'll feed on. If we look at tuna and seals, they're mostly just seasonal visitors to the island. And we see a lot of Atlantic bluefin tuna. And so it's interesting with the bluefin tuna, we actually know that they're tagged in Halifax. And so we can see them moving all the way up and down the coast. Using these arrays that we have set out, we can look at the west to east and then the east to west movement of the fall and spring runs of fish like striper and Atlantic sturgeon as they move along the coast. And we can see actual movement of horseshoe crabs that start inside the estuaries in the bay and then will move offshore to the reefs. And so we had one horseshoe crab who moved in 1 week from Great South Bay all the way out to Santa Moriches, which is something like 3 miles of movement, which if you think about it, that's a lot of scuttling, but very quickly scuttling. I like to think about that. And then so over time, we also have some more tropical species that we've been seeing more and more of. So we have spinner sharks that show up on our receivers, black tip sharks, hammerhead sharks, and cobia. And so if you've ever been out on the water on Long Island, you know that this matches up with kind of the stories that fishermen are seeing, because you'll hear, anybody see any cobia anywhere? So that lines up with that. We're getting more detections on the receivers. So if we kind of take a look at what it would look like on one piece of structure, we use our diving observations, we use eDNA techniques, and we use acoustic telemetry. We can paint a picture of what it may look like down on the Shinnecock artificial reef. So off in the sediment next to the artificial reef, we have things like flounder, which act as ambush predators, waiting for crustacean and fish to kind of wander off the side of the reef. Then we have monkfish hiding under the sand or under the structure. We'll have sea robins walking around, stirring up the sediment, getting caught by fishermen who are trying to catch black sea bass. We'll have tropical visitors, things like great triggerfish, which will come and eat crustaceans and mussels off of the reef. There are small cunner and tautog that are hanging out along the sides and on the bow. Then we'll have black sea bass we also find on the structure, but we'll also see them hanging out on areas with large vertical relief. It is a reef. We'll see striped bass and bluefish that will come and swim by and opportunistically stop to take a meal at the artificial reefs. We'll see big schools of scup and butterfish schooling around the bows and off the reef. And then we'll also see things like eels, cusk eels, American eels, and conger eels hiding in holes. And it's important to note that, so this is what the Shinnecock artificial reef looks like. Through some of that eDNA work that we've been doing and acoustic telemetry, we know that if this was a picture of 12 Mile, you would probably get rid of the triggerfish. You wouldn't see any triggerfish. There was no eDNA from sea robins or flounder. All that we detected were black sea bass, porgy, and striped bass. So a little note about the eels. Conger eels and American eels look very, very similar, and both actually spawn in the Sargasso Sea. Before you get this close or very close, you should make sure you can identify your American eels from a conger eels, because conger eels can take a nasty bite. So a note of warning. How do you know? They have different jaw shapes. If you find yourself down on a reef, American eels have like an underbite, so you can kind of look at the face, but that means you got to get close enough to tell. So you can always just stay back. Acoustic telemetry is only one of the ways that we can kind of get an idea of what's going on at these artificial reefs. So some of the work that the Warren Lab does, and one of Joe's students, Melissa, has been doing specifically, is using passive acoustics to look at how different animals use artificial reef habitats. So while our receivers are looking for those specific sound pulses sent out by our unique tags, Joe's receivers kind of act as big underwater ears that are made specifically to hear underwater and hear larger ranges of frequencies. So things that they'll pick up on the reef are cod. Hear that? Oh, there we go. There you go. And so cod are territorial. So we know that when they're making this noise, that they're actually using these reefs as spawning grounds. But what we hear most on the reef are boat noises. Loud boat noises. There's also a lot of things that we don't specifically tag that we can hear on these reefs, like marine mammals. Humpback whales. And we can hear things like dolphins. So dolphins are unique because they have individual signature whistles. So you don't need to tag a dolphin. Each dolphin has their own tag that is unique to an individual. We can hear dolphins. And so while on top of helping to provide data that is important to manage the species that use the reef to set recreational and commercial management to create better artificial reefs, we can also start to look at the reefs and the material on the reefs as possible analogies for wind farms, which are in themselves just large man-made structures. So we can look at the turbines themselves, and we can also look at the scour material and try to apply what we've learned about artificial reefs to the material itself. So we know that juvenile cod actually up north in Rhode Island will use scour material, and then they most likely go join the larger population of cod in the area. So I would like to take you guys on a trip diving with us, and there might be a quiz at the end, so you should pay attention. So normally what we'll do if you come out on the reef diving with us, we'll start the day nice and early. Here you can see me and Jess and Flynn. We're getting our gear together on the boat. So the first thing we do before we get out to the reef is that we set up, we put our BCDs together, we get our wetsuits on, and then we head out to 12 Mile, which is 12 miles south of Shinnecock. Yeah. And so today we are actually swapping out a receiver on the Dauntless, which is a boat that sits in 130 feet of water. Here you can see Brad. He's using an underwater drill to replace the hose clamp on a receiver, which attaches it to the structure. And so we'll swap out those receivers every 6 months. What we use is they use Bluetooth. So you can actually, if you took your phone underwater with you and you took the little Bluetooth activator, you could put it in and then download all of the data. So then after we are done putting down our receiver, normally what we'll do is we'll swim around, we'll take some footage for the DEC, look for cool things. And so at 130 feet, you run out of air faster than you can get cold. So we'll probably have around 12 minutes of bottom time. And that's okay, because even though it's July and the surface might be in the upper 60s, down at the bottom at 130 feet, it's probably in the upper 40s. And so from this video, first of all, you get an amazing day of visibility, but you can get a sense of how covered in life that these artificial reefs are, not just from fish. So you can see actually almost the entire length of this 50-foot boat. And once this is what we'll take our receivers back with us to the lab, download the data. And that's a day at the Peterson lab swapping artificial reefs. But you should always make sure that you're paying attention because there's lots of interesting marine life that you can see here on Long Island. There might be something like a mola mola hanging out in the water. And then it's always nice to take a little nap on the way home after a hard day's work. So if you are a recreational fisherman or a recreational diver and you want to help the DEC, what you can do is you can go to their website and fill out an artificial reefs survey after you've spent any time at the reef. And here's your quiz. So the things that are going on to our survey is contact information. So do you remember who was diving at the reef? You? It was me. Yeah, surprise, it was me. Hopefully you know my name. What reef we dove at? SoMAS. Yeah. What type of material we dove on? A boat. What was the visibility like? Great. Yeah. Water depth? 130 feet. Water temperature at the surface and the bottom? Cold. And any cool things that you saw out that day? Fish. We saw Brad. And so that is to say, if you are out there and you catch a fish that has any of these yellow conventional tags, they'll say Stony Brook, they might have a phone number on them. You could consider putting it back. These fish are collecting data, and that little yellow tag means that it's got an acoustic receiver in it. So in case you do end up taking it home, if it has any barotrauma, just make sure you take the receiver or the tag out because we don't want to be tracking you. We only want data about the fish. And so with that, I want to leave you guys with a little scene of what it can be like to just kind of take a second, sit inside one of the cargo holds of a ship like this and just watch the fish go by. Nice video. That's it. Yeah, and so now I'll take any questions from the Zoom and from the audience. Brad.
So you mentioned about the yellow tag and the tag you put in. How expensive is the tag you put in the fish?
Oh, yes. So an acoustic tag itself can range anywhere from $100 to $800. So it would be very nice if you put the fish back or at least gave it back. Is my plea.
So they can call you with that number.
Yeah, you can call me. Yeah.
You'll bring a 6-pack of beer.
I will give you a 6-pack of beer. Yes. I used to have in the last lab, it was a picture of a can of beer, but I figured for school purposes, we would take the beer out. Curious. So in our time, I got 3 instances where people have told me that they've caught fish. One time the person actually saw the tag, contacted Chris Paparo and said that he put the fish back, which was amazing. So I called him and I was like, thank you so much. Explained to him what was going on. Then there was one time where a person on a party boat caught a tagged fish and filleted the fish, took the acoustic tag out and gave it back. And then one time so a thing that I tend to do is I follow some of the fishing groups on Instagram. So I will zoom in on all of their pictures when they post the fish. And I actually saw one of our tags. So I was like, oh, someone caught a fish. No.
Julie Shepson has a question for you.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, was that me? Yeah. Brittney, that was great. Really enjoyed it. Learned a lot. That was cool. So some finite number of the offshore wind producers are interested in artificial reefs to be maybe deployed in or near the wind farms to have hopefully a positive impact on biodiversity in the region. I'm wondering if you would have advice for them about what kind of artificial reef would you build, or would you advise that they don't do it, or what advice would you have at this point?
Yeah, so for our reef specifically, especially in Shinnecock, we've found that things like vessels with high relief are really important to fish like black sea bass and tog. But for something like a wind farm, normally what they use is scour material, so large boulders and rocks that have lots of complexity of themselves, but not a lot of relief. So, I mean, I don't know how feasible it would be to deploy something like that, but large rocks and boulders have been shown to work well.
Thank you.
Greg?
So this was about artificial reefs.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a natural reef, or what would that look like, or what are natural reefs that we might see here on the South Shore?
Would you repeat the question?
Yes. So Greg asked about natural reefs on Long Island, where we might find them, what it might look like. So off the shore of Long Island, you wouldn't find any natural reefs. You would find things that have been unintentionally sunk, like the USS San Diego, which is actually sunk by a World War I U-boat. But where you would find fish like these are at jetties, are at big rock piles in the bays. That's the areas where you would find them. So you would see similar diversity. These are really the fish that we have on Long Island, or the fish that you're seeing on these artificial reefs. So you wouldn't see them in such large abundances. Well, there's also, if you notice, there's an Atlantic cod that swims by. I want you to put that out.
There's a question online that asks, what happens if a tagged fish becomes prey for a larger fish?
Also, this is one of my favorite questions. So just like if you were to eat the tag inside of a blackfish and we would be tracking you, that's exactly what happens underwater. So if a seal comes along and eats one of these fish, or if a bird comes along and eats one of these fish, you can tell by the data and the movement patterns that these fish exhibit what is going on. So let's say we have a blackfish that all of a sudden started jetting down the coast of Long Island. So we saw him move from the Shinnecock Reef all the way to Fire Island. We would know that that fish was probably eaten by a striped bass, by a shark, something that exhibits that shore to shore motion, because a blackfish isn't going to be able to do that. So you can also tell there have been studies where birds have eaten fish. So we can see the fish kind of hopping in and out of the water as the bird dives up and down. So looking at the data, we can really tell. And depending on the digestion of the animals, these tags can stay in the predators from weeks, days, to months at a time. Okay.
I'm wondering, how the reefs in New York, was the data show that it wasn't chance to
Yeah, so I know over time we've seen there's been a bounce back in black sea bass. Tog have actually been declining recently in the past. I'm not very versed in catch numbers, but kind of the overall basic, that's what I know is going on.
I think it's hard to teach.
Yeah.
After, you know, like with the pandemic, there were a number of boats that were bought. A lot of people were fishing in the previously were done in previous years.
Mhm.
It's hard to pull them out. But there's, you know, as the reefs have increased, there's been a higher number of people fishing on them. That's for sure. There's a question on the chat that says, what reefs bring in the most fish in marine life?
Oh, you know, it really varies from reef to reef. Like we were talking about, 12 Mile is significantly different than Shinnecock. So and the life that we see on the reefs vary. So some of our more western reefs, that's really the only place where we see things like dusky sharks. We see things like threshers. We don't really get the same type of fish at each exact reef. So I don't know if it's the amount of fish, but there's definitely different fish that are using different areas of the island and different reefs. Lucas.
Are there any economically important or ecologically important species that you aren't currently tagging that you'd like to tag?
Oh, okay. Well, if I just had to pick it's so important. I think things that we're looking at, we've hit a broad range of fish that we have on Long Island. If I had to pick another species to tag, I would pick blue sharks, just because I think they're very interesting. And so they're not really well studied on Long Island. And while they're mostly pelagic, they do spend some of the time earlier in the summer closer to the coast of Long Island. So I think that would be kind of an interesting thing to look at.
How do you know that 13-foot shark named Whitaker was actually at Shinnecock Reef?
Because we detected him on his way to Massachusetts. So that's some of the sharks that we have detected. Brad was asking about the bigger white sharks on the reefs. They're named, they're well known, they're tagged by well-known people like Greg Skolmol up in Massachusetts. And so we can actually see them moving by, and we detected this 13-foot white shark named Whitaker on his way up the coast. Greg.
A little bit of a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Are you seeing certain species like these ones that are just passing through? Are you seeing them maybe say only in the springtime and you won't see them in the fall migration, or vice versa? Or do you see them pretty evenly going up in the spring and coming back down in the fall?
Yeah, we do. We see a burst in the fall and we see the burst in the spring. We don't see them at all in the summer, your larger white sharks here. Just really in the fall and the spring, we catch them moving up.
So you see white sharks both spring and fall. What about like bluefin tuna and some of these other ones that are
Bluefin tuna actually spend a decent amount of time here. So we don't have them sitting at the reefs, but sporadically through the summer, kind of starting in July, once the water really warms up, we'll get little ephemeral bursts of bluefin tuna throughout the summer. And then once the summer ends, they kind of just dissipate. They slowly kind of decline and then are gone.
We have two questions yet in the chat. One of them is, Walt wants to know, have you seen any new corals showing up in recent years?
Oh, okay. I have not, as far as I know. The only coral that we have still is Atlantic star coral, northern star coral. But some of that stuff that we did get from that eDNA, so we started to see things like pinfish, which are a very southern species and have been well documented to be making their way up north. So we don't have any tagged ones, but from eDNA we have seen that.
And Matt wants to know, in what month did Whitaker ping on the reef?
So Whitaker actually showed up. He left 5 minutes before Brad and I were there. So we pulled up the receiver and we were able to see that 5 minutes before at the Shinnecock Artificial Reef, there was a 13-foot shark that we had missed. And if you know anything about Brad and I, you know that we will throw ourselves overboard as fast as possible if there's a shark around. So that was devastating.
Well, let's thank Brittney for her presentation. She'll be here the rest of the